At the age of 54, Mark Wahlberg stands as one of the most enduring icons of modern Hollywood, a man whose career journey has spanned music, film, and business. From his early days of fame as Marky Mark with the group Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch, and their chart-topping hit Good Vibrations that reached #1 on the Billboard charts, he transformed himself into an actor recognized by both critics and audiences. Films like Boogie Nights proved his acting ability, while The Departed earned him an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor. He continued to solidify his position with The Fighter, a film that won major awards and showed he was not just a box office star, but also a visionary producer. Over more than 3 decades in the industry, Mark Wahlberg has appeared in a series of global blockbuster films such as Transformers, Ted, Lone Survivor, and many others, pushing the total box office revenue of the films he has been involved in past billions of dollars. Beyond film, he has built a business empire with the Wahlburgers restaurant chain, sports brands, and various other investment projects, bringing his net worth into the hundreds of millions of dollars. To American audiences, he represents discipline, the image of a man who wakes up before dawn to work out, work hard, and hold himself to the strictest personal standards. But behind that spotlight is a truth that makes many people shudder. What would have happened if the world had never seen this man? Simply because he did not survive his own past. Before becoming a Hollywood icon, Mark Wahlberg was once a lost boy on the harsh streets of Dorchester, Boston, where violence and drugs crept into the lives of teenagers far too early. He was addicted to cocaine at a very young age, got into fights, and was pulled into wrong decisions that caused his family pain. A violent assault landed him in prison while he was still too young to be considered an adult, a moment that made many believe his life was over before it truly began. In those days, Mark Wahlberg was not a movie star or a successful businessman. He was just a boy fighting his own darkness, a boy carrying shame, regret, and the fear that he had destroyed his own future. But it was from what seemed like rock bottom that his willpower began to take shape. Instead of letting his past define him, he chose to fight, to change, to get back up, to prove that even a life that starts in mistakes can still rewrite a different ending. If the story of Mark Wahlberg's journey from darkness to light makes you think, please hit subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more powerful and inspiring stories like this one. After all the glamour that America has seen in later years, the real story of Mark Wahlberg began in a very different place. Not Hollywood, not the red carpets, but the cold streets of Dorchester, Boston in the 1970s. Dorchester back then was not a land of hope. It was a poor working-class neighborhood where old gray buildings stood crammed together, where windows were often broken, where dark alleys became hiding places for drugs and violence. There, kids learned to survive before they learned to dream. Police sirens rang out at night like a familiar sound, and street fights were not rare. In that world, Mark Wahlberg was born on June 5, 1971, the youngest child in a large family with 9 siblings. A small house, too many mouths to feed, and too little money. His father, Donald Wahlberg, worked various labor jobs to try to support the family, while his mother, Alma Wahlberg, worked tirelessly all day, first as a bank employee and later in restaurants, just to make sure the kids had food. But even with both parents trying, life was always short on everything. In such a big family, love sometimes had to be divided so thinly that many children felt overlooked. Mark grew up amid arguments, days when the electricity might get cut off at any moment, meals where everyone had to share tiny portions. When Mark was still very young, his parents' marriage began to crack. The arguments became more frequent. The tension in the small house grew heavier. And then the inevitable happened. His parents divorced. Mark was still a child when the family broke apart. That separation left a void he didn't know how to fill. Donald moved out, and Alma was left alone to raise 9 children. The burden on her shoulders was something very few could imagine. She worked almost non-stop, sometimes taking back-to-back shifts just to keep the family from sinking completely into poverty. But no matter how hard she tried, life remained harsh. With so many kids in the house, Mark often felt like he was just a tiny shadow in a world too crowded. No one deliberately abandoned him, but in the chaos of a large and poor family, Mark began to grow up feeling that no one truly saw him. The streets of Dorchester became where he spent more time than at home. There, kids learned different lessons, not about books or the future, but about survival. Older teens stood on street corners selling drugs. Fights broke out over the smallest reasons, and kids like Mark saw all of it every day until it became normal. While other children were dreaming of future careers, Mark began to believe he had no future at all. He saw no path out of Dorchester. No one showed him a different way. No one told him his life could become something bigger. The feeling of being forgotten began to sink deep into his soul. It didn't come in one big moment. It came slowly, day by day, like fog covering a city in the morning. Mark Wahlberg grew up thinking the world expected nothing from him, and so he expected nothing from himself. For that boy, Dorchester was not just where he lived, it was his destiny, and for many years Mark believed he would never escape it. But sometimes the darkest places are where the most unexpected stories begin, and the story of Mark Wahlberg, the boy who grew up amid poverty, chaos, and the feeling of being forgotten, is only just beginning. But the years that followed proved that Dorchester was not just where Mark Wahlberg grew up, but also where the darkness began to swallow his youth whole. As he entered his teenage years, the boy who once felt forgotten in a crowded family started seeking belonging elsewhere, on street corners and alleys, and with groups of young people living beyond anyone's control. School gradually became alien to Mark. The dull classes, the books he saw no connection to his real life, all made him feel like he was imprisoned in a world not meant for him. And then, like so many other kids in that neighborhood, Mark began skipping school. At first it was just a few days, then whole weeks. Eventually, he all but disappeared from school entirely. The mornings that should have been spent in class, Mark instead wandered the streets of Dorchester, where older youths quickly spotted him as an easy kid to pull into their world. Those street corners became Mark Wahlberg's new classroom. But the lessons there were very different. There, people learned to fight before they learned to talk. They learned to survive before they learned to dream. The small fights at first were just ways to prove himself, to not be seen as weak. But then they became more frequent. Mark started hanging with groups of friends who lived by street rules. Gangs, reputation, fear, that was what gave a lost boy a sense of power he had never had before. But that power came with a price, and that price arrived very quickly. Drugs entered Mark's life when he was far too young to understand the consequences. At first, it was just trying it to see. A dare from friends, a night when he thought he needed to forget everything. But those tries quickly turned into a habit. By his mid-teens, Mark had started using cocaine. It made him feel stronger, bolder, like nothing could scare him. But cocaine also turned him into a different person. Someone quick to anger, quick to violence, always living on the edge of danger. The fights became so regular, they were almost part of daily life. There were days Mark came home with bruises on his face. There were days he didn't come home at all. In the small house in Dorchester, Alma Wahlberg began enduring the longest nights of her life. After an exhausting day of work, she would sit in the living room, eyes fixed on the front door. The clock kept ticking. The night grew deeper. But Mark still wasn't home. In a neighborhood like Dorchester, every passing minute carried fear. A fight in the wrong place, a drug deal with the wrong person, a stray bullet. Alma didn't know where her son was. She didn't know if he was still alive. There were nights she sat like that until the sun began to rise. And when Mark finally walked through the door, the smell of smoke and the streets still on his clothes, she didn't yell. She just looked at him with a sadness he was too young then to fully understand. For Mark Wahlberg back then, Dorchester wasn't just where he lived. It had become the path he was walking, step by step, deeper into the darkness. His friends didn't talk about the future. They talked about fights, easy money, long nights with no rules. And Mark, the boy who once felt forgotten, began to believe this was exactly where he belonged. But looking back many years later, there's a saying that seems to sum up all those years of his life. Boston didn't raise Mark Wahlberg. The streets did. The streets taught him how to live, how to fight, and sometimes how to hurt himself. But they were also pulling him closer and closer to an event no one in the Wahlberg family could have imagined. An event that would later make all of America wonder, how could a boy who went that far ever find his way back? But then, like so many stories that begin in darkness, Mark Wahlberg's life reached a moment when nothing could ever go back to the way it was. In 1988, when Mark was just 16 years old, the streets that had nurtured his anger and recklessness finally led him to the biggest event of his youth. It wasn't just another night like the ones before, not just a small fight on a Dorchester corner that blew over like it never happened. That night became a milestone the entire Wahlberg family would never forget. In a fit of youthful rage and recklessness, Mark took part in a violent assault on two Vietnamese men on the streets of Boston. The punches, the slurs, the actions that at the time Mark thought were just another scuffle in the countless ones he'd been in. But this time, it went too far. Police showed up. Mark was arrested soon after, and for the first time in his life, he couldn't run from the consequences of his actions. As he was taken to the police station, the defiance of youth began to fade. The cold walls of the holding cell were nothing like the street corners where he'd once felt powerful. Here, there was no gang backing him up. No friends to laugh it off and say it'd be okay. Just silence and fear starting to creep into his mind. When the news of the incident reached the family, the shock nearly silenced them all. Alma Wahlberg heard that her son had been arrested and charged in a violent assault. This was no longer the street fight she could forgive and hope would get better. This was far more serious. This was something that could destroy her son's future. The days that followed were a tense chain in the Wahlberg household. Court hearings, charges, details of the incident repeated over and over. Mark Wahlberg, still just a teenager, stood before a legal system he never imagined facing. And then the verdict came. Mark was convicted and sent to prison. When the prison doors closed behind him, all the noise of Dorchester's streets seemed to vanish. No more familiar corners, no more old friends, just cold concrete walls and long stretches of time to think about everything that had happened. For Mark Wahlberg, it was the first time in his life he truly had to confront himself. In that small cell, the hours passed so slowly they were almost painful. Sleepless nights, thoughts swirling in his head. How did things go this far? How did the boy who once played in the small house in Dorchester end up behind bars? Shame began to emerge, heavier than any punch he'd ever taken in street fights. He thought about his mother, about Alma Wahlberg, the woman who worked non-stop to raise 9 children, the woman who waited for him every night, hoping her son would come home safe. And now, instead of waiting at the door, she had to visit him in prison. That shame felt like a rock on Mark's chest. He began to understand that his choices hadn't just destroyed his own life, they had hurt the people who loved him most. But along with the shame came another feeling: despair. Mark Wahlberg was only 16 then, but in his mind, his life already seemed over. Who would give a chance to someone who'd been to prison? Who would believe he could become anything else? Those thoughts haunted him every day. Outside, Dorchester kept going as always. The streets stayed noisy. Fights still happened. But for Mark, time seemed to stop. Prison wasn't just holding his body. It forced him to look straight at the person he'd become. And in those lonely moments, Mark began to feel a deep fear that his life might have ended before it truly started, that everything waiting for him ahead was just more mistakes, more darkness. That was the lowest point in Mark Wahlberg's life, a boy standing between youth and the future, but trapped in a cold cell, carrying shame, despair, and the fear that the road ahead was nothing but a dead end. But sometimes, the darkest places become the starting point for change. And Mark Wahlberg back then, though he didn't know it yet, was standing at a moment that could decide the rest of his entire life. The days in prison passed slowly and heavily, as if time itself was trapped behind those cold concrete walls. For Mark Wahlberg back then, every morning waking up was a reminder that he had gone way too far from the path any normal kid should take. But there was one day, one moment, that Mark Wahlberg would later recount many times throughout his life. The moment that changed the way he saw himself. That was the day his mother came to visit, the woman who had spent her entire life trying to keep her family standing amid the poverty and chaos of Dorchester, Alma Wahlberg. When Mark was told someone was there to see him, he didn't know how to feel. Part of him hoped it was his mom. Another part was terrified to face her, terrified to look into the eyes of the person who had always believed he could become something better. When the visiting room door opened, Mark saw her walk in. She looked smaller than he remembered, more tired. The years of non-stop work to raise 9 children had left their marks on her face. But what Mark remembers most wasn't that weariness. It was the silence. He had braced himself for anything. He thought his mother would be angry, that she would yell, ask why he did it, why he had ruined his life like that. But Alma did none of those things. She sat down across from her son, and then she began to cry. Not loud sobs, not accusations, just quiet tears falling. In the many years since, Mark Wahlberg would recall that moment with a pain that never fully went away, because in everything he had been through the fights, the nights wandering the streets, the hours in his cell, nothing made him feel worse than seeing his mother cry. No scolding, no anger, just a deep disappointment, so profound she didn't need to put it into words. In that moment, Mark understood something he had never understood before. His choices hadn't just destroyed his own life. They were breaking the heart of the woman who had done everything to protect him. Many years later, Mark Wahlberg spoke about that moment with a short but heavy sentence. That was the moment I realized I had broken her heart. That wasn't a line for dramatic effect. It was a real memory. Because in that cold visiting room, Mark Wahlberg saw for the first time the true consequences of the life he had chosen. He was no longer the rebellious kid from Dorchester, no longer the reckless teen who thought every fight was just a game. In his mother's eyes, he was just a son who had strayed too far. Mark sat there, not knowing what to say. Apologies felt too small for what had happened. He could only look at his mother and feel something he had never felt before, real regret. Some people change out of fear. Some change out of loss. But Mark Wahlberg began to change for a much simpler reason. He didn't want to see his mother cry ever again. That moment didn't instantly turn Mark into a new person. His mistakes didn't vanish overnight. But something shifted in his mind. For the first time, Mark Wahlberg started wondering if his life could be something different, if he could become the person his mother had once hoped for, if he could fix what he had broken. And though Mark didn't yet know where the road ahead would lead, that moment of seeing his mother cry became a deep scar in his soul. A reminder that no matter how far a person goes into the darkness, there's always a point where they have to stop and decide. Keep sinking, or start finding a way back to the light. After that night, after the moment of seeing his mother's tears, something began to change inside Mark Wahlberg. But change never comes alone. In the lives of people who have stood on the edge like Mark, there's always a hand needed to pull them back. And for Mark Wahlberg, the person who refused to give up on him was his older brother, Donnie Wahlberg. At that time, Donnie had already stepped into a world completely different from the streets of Dorchester. He was part of the boy band taking America by storm. New Kids on the Block, sold-out shows, girls screaming in stadiums, tours across the country. Donnie Wahlberg was living a life that Mark back then could barely even imagine. But despite the stage lights and fame, Donnie never forgot his lost little brother. He knew where Mark was. He knew what path Mark was on, and he knew that without someone pulling him back, that path could only end in tragedy. Donnie had seen too many boys in the Dorchester neighborhood go down that road. Some ended up in prison, others never got a second chance. So Donnie decided to do what not every brother has the patience for. He refused to give up on Mark. Conversations started happening more often. Donnie talks to his little brother about a different world, a world where Mark didn't have to prove himself with punches or street fights. A world where talent could open doors Mark had never thought existed. At first, Mark didn't fully believe it. Life had taught him that opportunities usually weren't for kids who grew up in Dorchester. But Donnie kept trying. He saw in his brother an energy that, if directed right, could become something powerful. Mark always had a raw confidence, a strong personality that others couldn't ignore. The problem was that energy was being wasted on violence and mistakes. Donnie believed music could change that. And so he began pulling Mark into his world, not with long lectures, but with opportunities. Donnie brought Mark to the studio. He let him see how music was made, how melodies could become something that millions of people listened to. For Mark, it was a world completely different from the corners of Dorchester. In the studio, no one cared where you came from. No one asked what trouble you'd been in. The only thing that mattered was what you could create. Gradually, Mark began to feel something new. The feeling that maybe he wasn't stuck in his past forever. Donnie also helped his brothers stay away from the old friends, the gangs that had pulled him into the darkness. That wasn't easy. The streets of Dorchester have their own way of holding people back, but Donnie was determined. He wasn't just a brother. He became Mark's guide during the most critical phase of his life. And then, step by step, Mark Wahlberg began stepping into music, not with the confidence of a star, but with the caution of a guy trying to find a different path. Donnie helped him record his first demos, helped him understand how to stand in front of a microphone, helped him believe that his past wasn't the end. Outsiders might think Mark Wahlberg's later fame came easily, but they didn't see the long talks between the two brothers. The times Donnie had to convince Mark that his life could still change without Donnie Wahlberg. Mark Wahlberg's story might have ended very differently, because in the years when Mark nearly lost himself, Donnie was the only one patient enough to stand there and tell him he could become something better. And it was that belief, the belief of a brother who wouldn't give up, that began to open the first door leading Mark Wahlberg out of the darkness of Dorchester. But neither brother yet knew that those small steps into the world of music would become the beginning of a journey that the whole of America would later come to know. Those first steps in music seemed to open a door that Mark Wahlberg had never thought he could walk through before. Thanks to the guidance and unwavering belief of his brother, Donnie Wahlberg, Mark began to leave the streets of Dorchester behind and move closer to a completely different world, the world of stage lights, recording studios, and dreams he had never dared to imagine before. But that journey didn't happen overnight. Mark was still the guy carrying a heavy past on his back. The mistakes, the memories of prison, the violent streets, all of it was still there, like silent shadows trailing every step he took. However, music began to give Mark something he had never had before, a chance to rewrite his own story. With Donnie's support and that of his collaborators, Mark started stepping into the world of hip-hop with a completely new image. No longer the lost teenager from Dorchester, he appeared in front of the public with a bold stage name, Marky. Mark. And from there, a new group was born, Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch. When the group released their first tracks, few could have imagined that the guy who had once sat in a juvenile detention cell could stand on stage in front of thousands of fans. But the unexpected happened. In 1991, the song Good Vibrations was released and quickly became a phenomenon. Its powerful melody, energetic rhythm, and Marky Mark's explosive energy sent the track straight to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. Suddenly, the name Mark Wahlberg was everywhere. On the radio, on television, in music magazines. Young audiences across America began to know Marky Mark as a new pop icon. Sold-out performances, interviews, photos on magazine covers. Mark, the boy who once thought his life would end on the streets of Dorchester, was now standing in the bright lights of fame. But fame doesn't always bring peace. For Mark Wahlberg, success came too fast, and his past had never truly disappeared. On the outside, the world saw a young, energetic star, a muscular, confident, tough rapper who seemed unbreakable. But inside, Mark still carried a feeling he could hardly explain: guilt. Guilt about the person he used to be. Guilt about the mistakes that had caused his family so much pain. On nights after a performance ended, when the applause from the crowd had faded, Mark often had to face himself in the silence. Fame can make people forget your past, but it doesn't make you forget it yourself. Mark Wahlberg understood that no matter what the world called him, Mark no matter how high his songs climbed on the charts, no matter how brightly the stage lights shone, his past still existed somewhere behind him. Sometimes it showed up in articles that brought up his youthful mistakes. Sometimes it appeared in quiet moments when Mark wondered if he really deserved this second chance. Fame brought money, attention, and power, but it couldn't heal the wounds Mark carried in his soul. And so, even as Marky Mark was becoming a pop icon of the early 1990s, Mark Wahlberg still felt like he was living between two worlds. One world was the stage lights where everyone saw a star. The other world was the memory of Dorchester, where he had once been a lost teenager trying to find his way out of his own darkness. Fame can change a person's life. But for Mark Wahlberg, it still couldn't heal the deepest wounds in his soul. And in the years that followed, he would gradually realize that music was only the first step in a long journey to truly find the person he wanted to become. Marky Mark's fame took Mark Wahlberg far from the streets of Dorchester, but it also placed him in front of a completely new challenger world where skepticism was every bit as harsh as the alleys where he grew up. As the music craze began to cool down, Mark started looking for a different path for his life. He looks toward Hollywood, where big stories are told and where people can be reborn with a new identity. But Hollywood didn't welcome Mark Wahlberg with open arms. In the eyes of many in the film industry at the time, he wasn't an actor. He was just a muscular rapper who had gotten attention with shirtless performances and one chart-topping hit, a fleeting pop phenomenon. A face that could appear on magazines but not on the big screen. Mockery started appearing right from Mark's first steps into acting. Critics said he lacked depth. Some in Hollywood laughed at the idea that Marky Mark could become a serious actor. In casting rooms, the name Mark Wahlberg was often mentioned with a smirk. "That rapper?" they would ask each other. "He thinks he can act?" The media didn't make things any easier. Articles often focused more on his past than on his current efforts. They wrote about the years Mark stood on stage with his abs showing under the lights. They wrote more about the image of Marky Mark than about the man trying to change behind that name. In the public's eyes, Mark Wahlberg was still the pop icon of a brief era, not an artist trying to build a lasting career. The Hollywood insiders were even more blunt. They believed Mark would soon fade from the spotlight. A few small films might give him a chance to try, but they didn't think he could last long in such a cutthroat industry. Some said he had no acting skills. Some said audiences would never see him as anyone other than Marky Mark, and some believed his troubled past would forever be the shadow that kept Hollywood from truly accepting him. For Mark Wahlberg, that kind of mockery wasn't unfamiliar. His life had been full of being underestimated. But this time the feeling was different, because Mark was no longer the rebellious kid from Dorchester. He was trying to become a different person, and every mocking laugh felt like a reminder that his past was still chasing him step by step. There were nights Mark wondered if they were right. Was he really just a lucky rapper who had a short moment of fame? Would Hollywood ever see the person he was trying to become? But if there was one thing Dorchester life had taught Mark Wahlberg, it was how to get back up when everyone thinks you failed. He kept going to auditions, kept taking small roles, kept learning from directors and more experienced actors. Mark didn't have the easy path many other stars had. No prestigious acting school, no powerful family in the industry. He only had one thing: the determination not to give up. And sometimes those very taunts became the fuel that made him try harder. Every mocking article, every condescending comment, every doubtful look made Mark want to prove them wrong. Not with words, but with work. He spent hours reading scripts, studying characters, learning how to understand emotions he had never expressed before. Gradually, something began to change. Directors started seeing in Mark a raw authenticity that not every actor has. Maybe because he had lived through things many could only imagine. Maybe because the wounds of his past had given him a deeper understanding of people and their pain. But at that point, Mark Wahlberg still didn't know that all it would take was one right role, one right opportunity for everything to change. The world can mock you for years, but sometimes it only takes one moment, one role, one film, for everyone to look at you with completely different eyes. And for Mark Wahlberg, that moment was getting closer than ever. The years of doubt and mockery seemed to stretch on endlessly for Mark Wahlberg. Hollywood still looked at him with skeptical eyes, as if waiting for the moment he would stumble to prove they had been right all along. But sometimes a person's life can change with just one single opportunity. And for Mark Wahlberg, that opportunity came in 1997 with a film that no one initially thought would become the turning point in his career, Boogie Nights. When director Paul Thomas Anderson chose Mark for the role of Dirk Diggler, many in Hollywood were surprised. Some even mocked the decision. In their eyes, Mark Wahlberg was still just Marky Mark, a rapper famous for his muscular image and loud performances. They didn't believe he could handle a complex role in a film that demanded real emotional depth. But Paul Thomas Anderson saw what so many others overlooked. He saw a vulnerability hidden behind Mark's tough exterior, a hurt that only someone who had lived through hard years could carry. And when the cameras started rolling, what Hollywood didn't expect happened. Mark Wahlberg didn't just act. He became the character. The role of Dirk Diggler was the story of a young man stepping into a world of fame, money, and attention, only to gradually lose himself in the process. Perhaps it was because Mark Wahlberg's own life had gone through similar spirals that he could bring such rare authenticity to the character. When the film was released, the critics' response changed almost immediately. Those who had once laughed at Mark began to see him in a different light. They no longer talked about Marky Mark. They started talking about Mark Wahlberg, the actor. Reviews praised his surprisingly powerful performance. Audiences saw a completely new side of the man they thought they already knew. And for the first time since stepping into Hollywood, Mark felt like he had proven something. Not to the press, not to the people who had doubted him, but to himself, because throughout all those previous years, Mark Wahlberg had carried the fear that his past would forever define who he was, that Hollywood would never give him a real chance. But Boogie Nights changed everything. After that film, doors began to open. Directors started seeing in Mark an ability they hadn't recognized before. He was invited to bigger projects, more complex roles. The films that followed continued to prove that the success of Boogie Nights was no accident. Mark Wahlberg began building a serious acting career, step by step, role after role. He took on diverse films, from action to drama, from war stories to tales of family and redemption, and each role forced Hollywood to readjust how they viewed him. Some films brought box office success, some brought critical respect, but more importantly, they brought Mark Wahlberg what he had been searching for all those years: recognition. No longer the rapper dabbling in movies, no longer the fleeting star of the 1990s. He became a real actor. The people who had once doubted him started changing the way they talked. Conversations in Hollywood began mentioning Mark Wahlberg with respect. And for Mark, that meant more than any award ever could. Because the road to that moment hadn't been easy. It started on the poor streets of Dorchester. From youthful mistakes he had carried for years. From the times he was laughed at when trying to enter an industry that didn't believe in him. But now, Mark Wahlberg stood in a completely different place. A place where those who had doubted him had to admit they were wrong. However, even as Hollywood's respect began to arrive, Mark still understood that his journey wasn't over. Because in the world of film, success isn't something you achieve once and keep forever. You have to prove yourself over and over again. And Mark Wahlberg, the boy who had once been underestimated by the world, was ready for that challenge. The success after Boogie Nights changed the way Hollywood looked at Mark Wahlberg. Directors began to respect him. Big scripts gradually found their way to him. Audiences slowly started to forget the Marky Mark image from the early 1990s and saw a serious actor maturing with each role. But there was one thing even success couldn't erase: the past. In the world of celebrities, the past never truly disappears. It sits there in old records, in old articles, in the memories of those who witnessed your mistakes. And for Mark Wahlberg, that past was especially heavy. As his film career began to grow, newspapers started digging up old stories. Articles recalled his violent youth in Boston, the street fights, the mistakes that brought him face to face with the law when he was still very young. For many journalists, it was a compelling story, the troubled kid who became a Hollywood star. But for Mark Wahlberg, every such article felt like a cut reopening memories he had worked so hard to move past. The headlines often didn't focus on his new roles. They focused on the past. They brought up things Mark had done when he was a lost teenager. And sometimes, when Mark read those lines, he felt like he was still trapped in the person he used to be. There were moments Mark wondered if the world would ever truly forgive him, if all the efforts to change, all the years of hard work, all the steps to become a better person would ever be enough to make the past stop haunting him. In the rare interviews when he spoke about it, Mark admitted that the feeling never fully went away. Success can bring money. It can bring respect. But it can't turn back time. Mark Wahlberg knew that some mistakes in life you carry forever. Some wounds you can't erase. You can only learn to live with them. And sometimes, in the quiet nights after filming Wrapped, Mark still thought about the boy who once ran through the streets of Dorchester. The angry, lost, rage-filled boy toward the world. The boy who caused his family pain. The boy who did things that later Mark would spend years trying to atone for. Mark once said there was a question that always came up in his head during those early years of his career. Is it possible I'll never escape the person I used to be? That wasn't the question of a Hollywood star. That was the question of a man trying to live better every day, but still afraid his past would always stand behind him, reminding the world who he once was. But perhaps that very fear was also what kept Mark Wahlberg from ever allowing himself to go back to the old path. He understood that every day he had a choice between letting the past define him or using it as a reminder to become better. So instead of running from his past, Mark gradually learned to face it. He spoke openly about his mistakes in interviews. He admitted he had done things that made him ashamed, and he didn't try to deny it. Instead, he tried to prove that people can change. But even as Mark Wahlberg was building a solid career in Hollywood, a completely new chapter of his life had not yet begun. Because through all those years, amid the stage lights and fame, Mark still hadn't found what would later become the most important thing in his life: true peace. And that peace wouldn't come from Hollywood. It would come from a completely different place: family. The years after his acting career began to stabilize, Mark Wahlberg continued to live between two worlds. One world was Hollywood, where he grew more and more successful, where new films were constantly being made, where his name gradually became a box office guarantee. But the other world was his private life, where Mark was still trying to find something that fame and money had never brought him: true peace. Throughout many years, Mark's romantic relationships often didn't last long. The life of a rising star was always full of upheaval: packed shooting schedules, media pressure, constant travel. And for someone who grew up amid chaos like Mark, finding stability in his personal life was anything but easy. But then, in the early 2000s, one person entered his life and gradually changed everything. That woman was Rhea Durham. When Mark and Rhea first met, their story wasn't like the noisy relationships often seen in Hollywood. No shocking tabloid headlines, no lavish parties. Rhea Durham brought Mark something he rarely experienced before: peace. Rhea was a successful model, but she wasn't caught up in Hollywood's frenzy like so many others. She had a calm, reserved, and grounded personality. And that very calmness seemed to be exactly what Mark needed most in his life at that time. In later interviews, Mark repeatedly said that Rhea helped him see life in a different way. When he was with her, he wasn't a movie star. He wasn't the man with a troubled past that the press always brought up. He was just Mark, a person trying to live better every day. Gradually, the love between them grew deeper. But what made this relationship different from Mark's previous ones wasn't just the emotions. It was the stability that Rhea brought. She didn't try to change Mark. She didn't force him to become someone else. But her presence made Mark want to become a better version of himself. For the first time in his life, Mark began to think seriously about family. Not the big, chaotic family he grew up in Dorchester, but a family of his own, where he could create a different environment for his own children. An environment full of love, stability, and hope. Rhea Durham became the center of that change. With her, Mark found a feeling he had never known how to name before: faith. Faith that the past isn't the only thing that defines a person. Faith that a boy who was once lost on the streets of Boston could still become a good husband, a good father. As they began building a life together, Mark Wahlberg also began to change the priorities in his life. His career was still important, but it was no longer everything. Long shooting days, big film contracts, all of it had to make room for something more important: family. As the months and years passed, the love between Mark and Rhea grew stronger and stronger. They built a home together, step by step, away from Hollywood's noise. And for Mark, it felt like a miracle, because if anyone had told the 16-year-old Mark Wahlberg, the boy wandering the streets of Dorchester, who once thought his life would end in prison or violence, that one day he would have a happy family, he probably wouldn't have believed it. But it was Rhea Durham's love that opened that new chapter in his life. However, Mark Wahlberg still didn't know that the most important role of his life wasn't as a rapper, nor as a Hollywood actor. The most important role for him would be as a father. And when his first children were born, Mark would realize that the biggest battle of his life was no longer fighting against his past. It was becoming the man his children could be proud of. His love for Rhea Durham brought Mark Wahlberg the peace he had never had throughout his chaotic youth. But even as his life began to stabilize more, Mark still didn't realize that the most important chapter of his life was still ahead, because there's a moment in every man's life that can change everything. The moment you look into your child's eyes for the first time. For Mark Wahlberg, that moment was like an awakening. When his first child was born, Mark felt an emotion he had never experienced before. Not the thrill of fame, not the joy of box office success, but a profound sense of responsibility that made him look back on his entire life. Gradually, Mark and Rhea Durham's family grew. They had 4 children together: Ella Ray, Michael, Brendan, and Grace. Their home was filled with children's laughter, rushed mornings getting ready for school, quiet family evenings together. For many people, that might just be a normal family life. But for Mark Wahlberg, it meant so much more. Because every time he watched his kids grow up, Mark remembered his own childhood. A childhood full of chaos, full of violence, full of wrong decisions. He remembered the streets of Dorchester, where he grew up. The nights his mother waited anxiously for her son to come home. The mistakes that caused his family pain. And when he looked at his own children, Mark understood that he never wanted them to go through a life like that. In many interviews, Mark Wahlberg once said a line that later became his life philosophy: "Being a father forced me to become the man I should have been all along." Being a father forced him to become the man he should have been all along. Children don't care if you're a movie star or not. They don't care how many successful films you have. They only care if you're there. If you listen to them, if you protect them from the mistakes you once made. And for Mark Wahlberg, that became the most important mission in his life. He began to change the way he lived, waking up very early every morning to pray and work out. Making time for family before starting work. Taking the kids to school. Attending their sports events, their activities. For Mark, those small moments were more valuable than any movie premiere. Because they were the things he never had when he was little, Mark understood that true success isn't measured only by money or fame. It's measured by what you leave for the next generation. And for him, the most important thing was making sure his children would grow up in a different world from the one he once knew. A world with stability, with love, with opportunity. Mark never hid his past from his children. He believed honesty was the best way to teach them about life. But he also wanted them to understand that people always have the chance to change. That mistakes aren't the end if you're brave enough to get back up and fix them. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the house was fast asleep, Mark Wahlberg would sit alone and think about his journey, from the lost boy on the streets of Boston to the father of 4 children sleeping peacefully in the rooms next door. It was a journey even he could hardly believe was real. But Mark Wahlberg's life hadn't stopped there yet. Because beyond family, he also found something else that helped him keep changing. Faith. And in the years to come, that faith would become the source of strength that helped him face his past, atone for his mistakes, and try to become a better person every day. As family life gradually became the center of Mark Wahlberg's world, he also began searching for something deeper, a spiritual foundation, to help him understand and face his entire life journey. Because even though he had become a father, a husband, and a respected movie star, Mark still knew his past couldn't simply disappear. There were memories, mistakes, and moments from his youth that he couldn't turn back time to fix. And it was in that process of reflection that Mark gradually found a new source of strength: faith. Mark Wahlberg grew up in a Catholic family, but like many kids raised in poverty and chaos, faith wasn't always central in his life when he was young. The rebellious years on the streets of Boston had pushed him away from many of the values his family had tried to teach him. But as he grew older, as he began looking back on his whole journey, Mark realized he needed something bigger than himself to help make sense of everything that had happened. Gradually, he returned to the Catholic faith, not just as a form of religion, but as a path to find forgiveness, both from God and from himself. Mark began making time for daily prayer, To many in Hollywood, that might sound strange. The world of film is often tied to parties, bright lights, and packed schedules. But Mark Wahlberg built a very different routine. He would wake up very early in the morning, before the rest of the world started moving. In those quiet hours, Mark spent time praying, reflecting, and mentally preparing for the new day. He once said, those moments helped him stay balanced between fame and his true self. Faith also helped Mark look at his past in a different way. Instead of just seeing mistakes and shame, he began to see lessons. The streets of Dorchester. The rebellious years. The moments when he hurt his family, all of it stopped being just wounds and became reminders of the person he never wanted to go back to. Mark Wahlberg has admitted many times that faith didn't erase his past, but it helped him face that past with humility. It helped him understand that people can change if they truly want to. And more importantly, it helped him believe that forgiveness is real. Over the years, Mark has also tried to use his life as a way to atone for old mistakes. He got involved in charity work, supported community organizations, and helped young people from tough backgrounds, kids who might be standing at the same crossroads he once stood at when he was young. Because Mark knows exactly what it feels like to be a boy growing up in chaos and thinking he has no future. And he wants to prove that isn't true. In many interviews, Mark Wahlberg has said that faith became the compass of his life. When facing tough decisions, when dealing with the pressures of fame and work, he always returns to the values faith brings: humility, responsibility, and gratitude. Because after everything that happened in his life, Mark understands he got a second chance not everyone gets. And for him, the only way to honor that chance is to live each day knowing his life no longer belongs just to him. It belongs to his family, to the people who believe in him, and to those looking at his story to find hope for their own lives. But even as Mark Wahlberg found faith and peace in family, time kept moving forward. The chaotic years of youth gradually became memories, and as he entered his 50s, Mark began looking back on his entire journey from the lost boy in Dorchester to the man the world sees today. It was a journey full of pain, mistakes, redemption, and hope. And at 54, Mark Wahlberg began to understand more clearly than ever what his life truly means. Time passes much faster than people usually realize. The chaotic youth of Mark Wahlberg now lies far behind. The streets of Dorchester, the long nights full of violence, and the mistakes that landed him in prison. All of it feels like another life. And as he turned 54, Mark Wahlberg began looking back on his whole journey with a calm that the hot-headed teenager back then never had. At 54, Mark no longer has to prove who he is to Hollywood. His career has spanned decades with successful films, major production projects, and a solid place in the industry. Audiences around the world know him not just as an actor, but also as a producer and businessman. But when Mark looks in the mirror every morning, the first thing he thinks about isn't his career. He thinks about the person he used to be. There are moments in Mark Wahlberg's life that he knows if just one decision had been different, everything could have ended very differently. If that Dorchester boy had kept walking the path of violence, if his youthful mistakes hadn't been stopped in time, if his family hadn't had enough patience to believe he could change, Mark's life could have ended in prison or in obscurity. But life sometimes has turning points we only understand years later. At 54, Mark Wahlberg looks back and sees a chain of moments that changed everything. His mother's tears in the prison visiting room, his brother Donnie Wahlberg's belief when he was lost, the opportunity to step into music, the door to film that opened after Boogie Nights, and then the family he built with Rhea Durham. Those things didn't happen all at once. They happened in small steps, year by year, like bricks building a completely different life. But what makes Mark think the most at 54 isn't the success, not the money, not the fame. What he thinks about most is the question, how could a boy who was once so lost stand here today? When he looks at his children, Ella, Michael, Brendan, and Grace, Mark realizes the answer isn't in Hollywood. It lies in the choices he was forced to make after facing the lowest point of his life. Some people change when they achieve success, but Mark Wahlberg changed when he faced failure, when he saw his mother cry, when he realized that if he kept living the way he was, he would lose everything. And at 54, Mark understands his past will never completely disappear. The mistakes of his youth are still part of his story. But the most important thing is they no longer control his life. In one conversation when asked about his journey, Mark once said a very simple but meaningful line. I still carry my past with me, but it no longer controls me. I still carry my past with me, but it no longer controls me. For Mark Wahlberg, that statement isn't an inspirational slogan, it's the truth. The past is still there. It reminds him of who he used to be, but instead of dragging him down, it has become a reminder of the person he never wants to go back to. And as he steps into 54, Mark Wahlberg realizes his journey isn't just the story of a Hollywood star. It's the story of a boy who once thought his life was destined for violence and mistakes, but ultimately found a different path. A path leading to family, faith, and maturity. And when looking back on that whole journey, Mark knows the greatest thing he achieved isn't the films or the box office numbers. The greatest thing is that he became the man that Dorchester boy never thought he could become. But Mark Wahlberg's story isn't over yet, because a person's true legacy isn't measured by what they achieved for themselves. It's measured by what they leave behind for the world after their story is told. And that's exactly what Mark Wahlberg is trying to build every day for the rest of his life. And when the story of Mark Wahlberg's life is looked back on from the end of this journey, what emerges isn't a perfect story. It isn't the story of a man who always did everything right. It isn't the story of a star born to succeed. In fact, Mark Wahlberg's story began in the complete opposite place. It began in darkness. Because Mark Wahlberg wasn't always the man the world sees today. He was once a rebellious boy on the streets of Dorchester, a teenager pulled into drugs, violence, and wrong decisions, a young man who caused his family pain, who made his mother cry in the prison visiting room, and who made himself believe his future was probably destroyed forever. Mark Wahlberg committed crimes. He lived in anger and chaos. He wandered so far off track that even he didn't know where he would end up. And if his life had stopped there, his story might have been just one of thousands of sad stories about boys growing up amid poverty and violence. But Mark Wahlberg's life didn't stop there. Because something happened that not everyone gets the chance to experience, he changed. Not in one day, not by a miracle. Mark's change happened slowly, painfully, and with full effort. It began with the moment he saw his mother cry. It continued when his brother Donnie Wahlberg refused to give up on his little brother. It grew when Mark stepped into music, then film, then built a family with Rhea Durham. But more important than anything, that change came from inside Mark Wahlberg himself, because no one can change a person if they don't want to change. Over the years, Mark has tried to atone for the mistakes of his youth, not by denying his past, but by facing it. He speaks openly about his mistakes. He admits the things that make him ashamed, and he uses his story to remind people that anyone can always get back up after falling. That's why Mark Wahlberg's story isn't just a Hollywood story. It isn't just the story of a successful actor. It's a story of a redemption, of the human ability to change the direction of one's own life. When Mark Wahlberg looks at his children, he doesn't want them to see a movie star. He wants them to see a man who learned from his mistakes. A father who truly understands the value of a second chance. A man who knows that real success isn't about becoming famous. It's about becoming better every day. And perhaps that's Mark Wahlberg's true legacy. Not the films he starred in, not the box office numbers, not the mansions or luxury cars. His true legacy is the journey from darkness to light, a journey many once thought impossible. When Mark Wahlberg's story is retold, people might talk about his success in Hollywood. But those who truly understand this story will know that the most amazing thing isn't that Mark became a star. The most amazing thing is that Mark Wahlberg did not become the person his past had once destined him to be. Because some lives begin in light. But there are also lives that begin in deep darkness, and the bravest people aren't the ones who never got lost. The bravest are the ones who got lost, who fell, who hurt the people they loved, but still found their way back. Mark Wahlberg isn't a perfect person, but that's exactly why his story matters, because it reminds us that people aren't defined by their worst mistakes. People are defined by what they do afterward. And if there's one final message that Mark Wahlberg's life leaves for the world, perhaps it's as simple as this. Some lives begin in darkness, but the bravest men are the ones who fight their way into the light. The story of Mark Wahlberg's life is both heartbreaking and deeply inspiring, because it reminds us that behind the glamour of Hollywood, there are sometimes wounds that society once overlooked. From a boy growing up in the violence-filled Dorchester neighborhood of Boston, where drugs, poverty, and crime surrounded his childhood, Mark soon slid onto the wrong path, dropping out of school, joining gangs, committing acts of violence, and ultimately facing prison while still very young. The moment his mother, Alma Wahlberg, quietly cried in the prison visiting room is one of the most painful details of the story, because those very tears made him realize how deeply he had hurt his family. But what makes this story worthy of respect isn't that Mark became a star, but that he chose to change. His brother Donnie Wahlberg's persistence in pulling him off the streets, the turning point with the film Boogie Nights when Hollywood finally saw his acting ability, and especially the family he built with Rhea Durham, show a man who step by step rebuilt his life. When Mark says that becoming a father forced him to become the man he should have been all along, that's not just words from an actor. It's the confession of someone who once stood on the edge of the abyss. For American society, this story carries a very real lesson. Many troubled young people in poverty and violence aren't that way because they were born bad, but because they lacked opportunity and guidance. Mark Wahlberg is proof that a second chance can change an entire life. And in a country that always talks about second chances, his story reminds us that faith, family, and personal responsibility can turn a past full of mistakes into a legacy of redemption. If the story of Mark Wahlberg's journey from the darkness of Dorchester to a new life has touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring the real stories behind the legends together. Thank you for watching until the end, and see you in the next video, where we'll keep finding hope in lives that once began in darkness.